A white bird perched on a sword's hilt surveyed the desolate, snowy battlefield. It took flight, soaring over the endless fallen. In the midst of the carnage, a lone warrior breathed in the frigid air, his golden hair a stark contrast to the white fur of his collar. He faced a horde of hulking monsters, his sword ready. His mind drifted back through a long span of time, filled with countless tribulations and endless wars. Countless heroes had been born from that bloodshed, and he had always been at the center of it all. He had existed as the magic sword Gruhorn. His armored boot crunched on the frozen ground. But that was the past. Now he stood alone against a new tide of enemies. A brutish monster charged with its axe raised high but was met with swift, brutal force. An entire army of them roared in unison, their breath probably smelling worse than their attitude. He was no longer just a sword, he was a knight. A torrent of blue energy erupted from his blade. His eyes, a brilliant sapphire, held an unyielding resolve. The snow-covered mountains and blood-soaked walls bore silent witness to the impending clash. His soldiers knelt, awaiting the command, their armor covered in frost. Only the sound of the war horn echoed out, heralding the dawn charge. His companions stood ready by his side. A massive wave of blue aura surged forward, engulfing the battlefield as a notification rang in his mind that a large-scale war had begun. He leaped into the fray, thinking of the ancient, forgotten heroes who had once wielded him. He cut through the enemy ranks with practiced ease, recalling those he once served. He saw their faces in his mind's eye. All of them had been his friends, his teachers, and his disciples. Each one was a legend in their own right. The myths they achieved all stemmed from him. He paused for a moment, a smear of blood on his cheek. His gaze was steady. Now, in this final era of tribulation, he faced their monstrous leader. The massive creature roared, its power immense. But the knight's eyes blazed with a fierce blue light as he braced himself for the final clash. He vowed that they would fight together and overcome this last challenge. A confident smirk touched his lips. They would all become a myth once again. My life began as a sword. For centuries, I was wielded by many masters, forging them into heroes whose names would echo through history. Then, I met my comrade. He was just a boy from a nameless village, Leon Burke. We carved our way through hordes of monsters and roamed the world together, achieving feats no one could ever match. Our final battle took place amidst the storm-racked peaks of the Frost Mountains. A blinding explosion rocked the landscape. Leon Burke coughed up blood, but his resolve was unshaken as he knelt in the snow. The white dragon descended, its maw crackling with terrifying power. Leon Burke faced the beast head-on as it unleashed a devastating blast of energy. My blade glowed with a brilliant blue aura as he channeled his power, speaking to me as his friend. He launched himself into the air, a blur of fury. Our power met the dragons in a cataclysmic clash. With one final decisive leap, we pierced the beast's armored hide, ending the threat of the white dragon of the Frost Mountains. In the wake of our victory, my comrade became the ruler of a kingdom, and I, the legendary dragon slayer Gruhorn, was passed down through his lineage, entrusted with the sacred duty of protecting his descendants. I fell into a long slumber, only to be awoken by an irritating clamor. Some insolent fool was shaking me, and the disturbance was infuriating. A loud, grating voice declared himself my new master. Guards protested, explaining that only His Majesty could touch the sacred sword. A prince, then? This fat pig was a prince? This couldn't be right. I had to use my authority, judgment. The results were disappointing. Adrian Leon Burke, age 16, with traits including morbid obesity, laziness, and a mana sensitivity disorder. He was my comrade's descendant, but his potential was non-existent. The boy strained to lift me, muttering that with my power no one would ignore him again. What a ridiculous man. He then demanded I lend him my strength, screaming my name and flailing me about the throne room. The palace staff scattered in terror. He roared at them, threatening their lives, convinced he was invincible. In his clumsy rage, he tripped over his own feet. There was a sickening squelch. He had fallen directly onto my blade. The entire court gasped in horror, a maid covering her mouth in shock. Guards rushed forward, shouting for the royal physician as their highness lay in a spreading pool of his own blood. I was confused. My vision began to blur, and for the first time in my long life as a sword, I felt myself about to faint. The first prince, Adrian Leonberg, was known for his lack of royal talent and unmatched greed. He was a stupid, lazy, and cruel pig, a dark cloud hanging over the kingdom's future. After his near-fatal accident, rumors of a change began to spread among the maids. They whispered that perhaps the prince felt some shame, though they expected him to revert to his old ways soon enough. But I, the new occupant of this body, had no time for rumors. I was horrified. I had killed my comrade's descendant and stolen his body. A servant announced a visitor. I grumbled, questioning why this person was visiting now when they hadn't bothered before. The maid nervously shushed me, reminding me of the nearby royal knights with their sharp ears. An old man entered, remarking that my temper was unchanged. He dismissed the maid and identified himself as my teacher. This pig had a teacher? I feigned memory loss, which only seemed to annoy him. Before he could press the matter, the king was announced. So, this was the scoundrel's father. I was surprisingly impressed by his regal bearing. The lion's blood was still strong in him. The king was not so impressed with me, scolding me for my lack of respect. My teacher quickly explained my memory loss, sending the court into a frenzy. The royal physician was summoned but could find no abnormalities, diagnosing it as a temporary condition caused by shock. Did he buy it? The king called my memory loss convenient, questioning if it absolved me of my past sins. He lectured me on learning from mistakes, declaring that by forgetting everything I had learned nothing and would never move forward. The guards had to restrain him. I had really stepped in it this time. This kid was treated worse than a dog. What had he been doing with his life? Suddenly, a woman called out a name and rushed to smother me in a hug. I could barely breathe. She lamented how my beautiful face had wasted away. I silently wondered where exactly it had wasted away to. She was just happy I was awake and warned me against touching dangerous objects like a helicopter parent with a sword. I felt a pang of guilt. I was sorry, but her son was already dead. This was all incredibly burdensome. After she finally left, I let out a long sigh. It was an accident, but I was the one who had ended his life. Since it turned out this way, I would have to live well for the both of us. I had spent my entire existence cleaning up after others. This was just another Tuesday. Clenching my new fleshy fist, I resolved to build up power again. I've raised countless heroes. How hard could one more be? First things first, I needed to forge a mana heart. I took a deep breath and focused, drawing in the surrounding mana. But as soon as it gathered, it dispersed, refusing to settle in my chest. This body couldn't accept it. I tried again, and again, pushing until I collapsed, face first on the floor. What the hell kind of body was this? I collapsed, utterly spent. What in the world was wrong with this body? In my original form, fixing a constitution like this would have been a simple matter of forcing mana into it. A voice interrupted my thoughts, announcing an intrusion. A maid entered, presenting a restorative medicine from the queen. She urged me to consider Her Majesty's feelings, though the bitter taste was a known issue. I could see the fear in her eyes. She was clearly hoping I wouldn't throw the bowl at her like last time. But as I looked at the medicine, I realized it contained mana. Without a second thought, I snatched the cup from the tray and drank it all down in one gulp. The maid stared in stunned silence. I slammed the empty bowl back on the tray and dismissed her. She scurried away and I got back to work. With the added boost from the medicine, I was finally able to gather a small amount of mana in my hand. It was a start. The amount was minuscule and would dissipate within a day, but it was progress. I called the maid back in and asked if she had any more of the medicine. A few days later, I had gathered a significant amount of mana. Finally, I could create a mana heart. I had done this countless times before. I could do it with my eyes closed, but as the mana began to coalesce, an excruciating pain shot through my chest. My insides felt like they were on fire, and my chest was about to explode. I had forgotten. Making a mana heart was always supposed to be this painful. I couldn't lose consciousness. If I passed out now, I'd suffer from mana backflow. I grit my teeth and focused, seizing the wild clump of mana. Slowly, carefully, I guided it along the pathways of my heart, allowing the new energy to permeate my very being. I held my breath, my eyes wide with concentration. Finally, it was done. This time it wasn't a mana heart for someone else. It was for me and me alone. It was complete. As I celebrated my success, a strange notification appeared before my eyes. A status window? It was identical to the ones I used to send to my masters. Then, another message appeared, restoring connection to the origin. A flurry of notifications followed, informing me of an unstable connection, unavailable authorities, and limited use of judgment. 2 more authorities, Third Eye and Third Ear, were also available for extremely limited use, allowing me to see and hear better. Authority? I looked out the window, and the world was indeed clearer than before. I strained my ears and could hear the maids whispering outside my door, marveling at my uncharacteristically calm demeanor. The enhanced senses were powerful, but they came at a cost. My internal mana was fully depleted, and the authorities were forcibly terminated. So, this was what extremely limited meant. The absolute senses I possessed as a sword were gone. Now, I could only manage small feats like eavesdropping or seeing a bit better, and even that was like trying to pay rent with pocket lint. I needed to expand my mana pool. After all that exertion, I was suddenly ravenous. I needed to adapt to this human body, and that meant eating. The queen was overjoyed to hear I had finished her medicine, pinching my cheeks and declaring that I was finally learning to treasure my body. A man's shadow fell over us, and she asked if I recognized him. I did not. She seemed to take this as confirmation of my memory loss and introduced him as her brother, my uncle. He didn't seem particularly thrilled to see me. My newfound uncle made it clear that the only help he would offer was to remove some of my flab. The queen was ecstatic, but he warned her not to have any useless expectations. I was confused. His glare was intense. Then, with a swift kick, he sent me sprawling. He informed me that from now on I would need his permission for everything, even breathing. If I expected to be treated like a prince, I should give up now. But if I tried my best, he might deign to teach me a shred of their family's secret swordsmanship. How ridiculous. He was offering to teach me, the one who had taught the undefeated knight and the founding king. He noted my resentment and I, refusing to be cowed, proposed a bet. Within half a year, I would make him acknowledge me. If I failed, I would do whatever he said. But if I succeeded, he would grant me a wish. He found this interesting and agreed, citing the need for some entertainment. I had talked big, but this damn body was a major hindrance. Still, I had a plan. I would use mana to burn the fat from my body. My uncle watched in disbelief as I began to channel my newly formed mana heart. He looked down at me, his eyes wide with shock. He asked if I had actually created a mana heart. I confirmed that I had and asked if he regretted our bet. He demanded to know what I was thinking and where I had learned such a technique. A mana heart? It was a crude technique used only by low-level mercenaries. What? This truly was the end of an era. My uncle explained that a mana heart was a crude technique only used by low-level mercenaries. I demanded to know what he meant, and he decided it would be faster to show me. He gathered a ring of mana in his hand, a technique I had never seen before. He then sent a wave of energy toward me, and I instinctively raised my own to block it. He explained that mana chains could shatter the sword energy of a mana heart and were far more stable. A family that had stubbornly clung to mana hearts had fallen into ruin a century ago. No one used them anymore. Times really had changed. I learned that while mages used circles to gather mana, knights now used chains. A knight's power was measured by the number of chains they could weave, from a single chain up to a pentachain. I suppose the new technique wasn't complete garbage. I noticed the name of the mana chain founder, Ernest Altrinian, on the cover of the book. The name was familiar. A very long time ago, a man named Ernest Altrinian had challenged my master, claiming to be more worthy of the title Sword Saint. No wonder the name sounded familiar. What had happened to that guy again? The next day, I was in the training grounds, stretching my surprisingly flexible body. My uncle asked if I had read the book, claiming I must now understand how foolish my choice had been. I told him I didn't feel like I'd made a mistake at all, which clearly annoyed him. He questioned if I was being stubborn or just hadn't grasped the situation. I explained that not all mana hearts were the same. I asked if he had ever heard the phrase, difference in class. He scoffed, unimpressed by my supposed nonsense. He told me that mercenaries often deluded themselves into thinking they were heroes from a bygone era. But they all fell away, unable to surpass even 2 rings. If I was different, he challenged, I should try defeating a double-chain knight. If I succeeded, he would become my guardian, as my mother wished. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing, and my hesitation did not go unnoticed. He questioned if I was doubting his qualifications. He was a count, the commander of the Northern Army, master of the Black Lancers, and one of the 5 silver lions who served the king. A powerful aura erupted around him. He was a quad-chain knight, and his name was Vale Balorhard. He asked if his qualifications were sufficient. Before I could answer, he charged. His own men had to intervene, shouting for him to stand down. He stopped with a smirk, and I told him not to go back on his word. A short while later, I was collapsed on the floor, utterly exhausted. I dragged my aching body to a nearby table, convinced I had nearly died. My uncle's mocking voice echoed in my head. That devilish bastard. Back in my chambers, the royal physician was waiting for me. He was humbled that I remembered him. He was there because the queen had ordered healing magic for me. I recoiled in horror and practically threw him out of the room. All that hard work would go to waste if he healed me. A nearby knight looked on in silent judgment, his expression unreadable. The next day, I had another visitor. My younger brother, the 3rd prince, had come to see me. I tried to enjoy my soup, but his presence was unsettling. My escort knight identified him for me. The 3rd prince remarked that I looked better than he expected. What a shame. I asked him what he wanted, unimpressed by his attempt to pick a fight. He retorted that at least he hadn't stuck a sword into his own body. He had heard an interesting piece of news, something about a bet and a duel with a double-chain knight. He had a proposition. How would I like him as my opponent? So, what the hell was that guy just now? Why were all the Leonberg descended so extra? My escort knight explained that the 3rd Prince Gillian had been a renowned swordsman since childhood. Apparently, he had woven 2 rings at the tender age of 14. Impressive, I guess. A maid interrupted, apologizing for the intrusion. She presented me with a massive pile of letters.
Letters? For me?
Why were these people, who had previously ignored this body, suddenly so interested? I flipped through them, confused. They were all from people apologizing for past transgressions and humbly requesting a duel. In short, they all wanted a chance to legally beat up the scoundrel prince. It seemed I had become an easy target. I called the maid over and instructed her to write down the names of everyone who had sent a letter. In the training yard, a wooden sword clattered to the ground. I looked at it, then at my uncle, unimpressed. He told me to pick it up. He explained that I needed to know the basics of swordsmanship for our bet to be valid. I knelt to pick up the sword, muttering about his unpleasant personality. As I stood, a wave of muscle pain shot through me. My uncle asked if I had refused the healing magic. I retorted that as a knight, he should know that healing magic only restored muscles to their original state. It didn't help them grow. He conceded the point and moved on, telling me to watch closely as he would only show me this once. He demonstrated the kingdom's basic training sword style, a series of precise and powerful movements. His eyes glowed with an inner light as he channeled his mana, each slash a blur of controlled energy. He moved with a grace that defied his age, his form perfect. The sword seemed to be an extension of his own body, culminating in a final powerful strike that sent a shockwave through the training yard, cracking the very flagstones. I was stunned. I asked if that was really the basic sword style. He just stared at me. He admitted that the training sword lacked sharpness, but it was faithful to the basics. Considering my talent, it might be too much for me. I just stood there for a moment, then burst out laughing. The great Dragon Slayer swordsmanship that had beheaded the Mad Dragon was now being treated as a trivial training technique? The irony was almost too much to bear. My uncle offered to let me beg my mother for a different teacher after mastering the basics, but I refused. I would not learn any other swordsmanship. This alone was enough. He looked at me for a long moment, then told me to do as I pleased. I gripped the wooden sword and began to practice. The fact that the Dragon Slayer style was now considered a trivial training technique was a natural phenomenon, I supposed. I hated to admit it, but it made sense. The style lacked the will to slay dragons. Those who had thrown away the mana heart and forgotten how to imbue their will into the sword could never recognize its true value. My swings were clumsy and weak, my body refusing to cooperate. My uncle berated me, reminding me that tensing my arms wasn't enough. He poked me in the belly and then in the legs, explaining that I needed to channel strength through my entire body. He was right. Even though my current body was weak and clumsy, mimicking a pale imitation of the Dragon Slayer style, I would prove that it wasn't some old junk to be thrown away like worn-out shoes. One day turned into 3, and then a week passed. I continued to train relentlessly, and a month went by in a blur of sweat and pain. I pushed myself to the absolute limit, and finally, a notification appeared. My arduous training had paid off. My morbid obesity had changed to general obesity, and my clumsy trait had disappeared. The effect of exercise had increased significantly. I felt a surge of energy as my mana sensitivity disorder was replaced with mana sensitivity. I swung the sword, my movements more natural than they had been a month ago. I was stronger than yesterday. A voice in my head screamed at me to stop, but I pushed on, my form becoming more perfect with each passing moment. My uncle shouted at me to stop, and a real sword shattered my wooden one, the splinters flying through the air. We stood in the pouring rain, the broken pieces of my sword at my feet. Blood dripped from my hand, pooling on the wet ground. I looked up at my uncle confused. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and concern. A lightning bolt crashed down nearby, illuminating the training yard in a flash of brilliant light. My eyes glowed with an otherworldly blue. He grabbed me, calling me a stupid fool for training in such weather. He pointed out that if he had used a real sword, I wouldn't have escaped unscathed. I looked down at my bruised and battered hand. Another notification appeared. I had awakened from a state of extreme concentration, and the sensation had created a new trait. Hyper-focus. I let out a weak laugh. If I focused twice, I might just get struck by lightning and die. My escort knight rushed forward, calling out my name in alarm. My uncle just stood there, his expression unreadable. Foolish brat. I woke up with a gasp, momentarily disoriented. I had lost consciousness. I hadn't known the limits of this body. As a sword, I had achieved everything possible, guiding heroes and leading wars to victory. I was Gruhorn, a wise advisor and excellent teacher, but always a third party. That was why I had pushed myself so hard, intoxicated by the feeling of making all the sweat and effort entirely my own. But at this rate, this weak body would break. I needed to find a balance between mind and body. It had been over a month since I formed my mana heart, and I had gathered a decent amount of mana. I was ready to move to the next stage. I sat in meditation, and a notification appeared, informing me of my progress. My body could now withstand more mana, and my mana heart had expanded. This allowed my body to withstand even more mana, and my constitution had changed. I could feel the power coursing through me. It was done. I picked up a real sword, its weight familiar in my hand. Another notification appeared. I had reached the rank of sword learner, and could now use a basic level of aura. With this, I could handle the basics. In the training yard, my uncle informed me that rumors of our bet were spreading throughout the kingdom. He was annoyed and suggested I find a duel opponent quickly. I told him I had already decided who it would be. It would be difficult to face a double-chain knight right away, so I suggested starting with some single-chain opponents. He agreed, leaving the choice to me. I turned to my escort knight, Carl, and asked for the list I had requested. He presented it to me, the list of those who had sent duel requests. He asked if I intended to have practice duels with them. He warned me that most of them held a grudge against me and might try to harm me under the guise of a duel. I knew that. That was why I needed my uncle to referee. I wasn't asking for much, just for him to prevent anyone from dying. He could grant me that much, right? A few days later, it was the day of the first duel. My opponent, Taylor Tailheim, stood before the gates of my palace. He was the second son of a baron. A few years ago, the former prince had publicly humiliated his father and brother at a royal banquet, turning them into laughingstocks. The family's honor had been dragged through the mud, and Taylor was here to make me pay for it. He formally introduced himself as a single-chain apprentice knight. I nonchalantly remarked on his formality, questioning if he was really a knight because he looked incredibly weak. He was incensed, just as arrogant and rude as the rumors said. My uncle stepped in, telling him to retract his spirit as the duel had not yet begun. Taylor was starstruck, fawning over my uncle like a groupie meeting their favorite rock star. It was an honor to meet him. Someone might think my uncle was the prince. My uncle retorted that I should have behaved better in the past. He ordered us to take our positions, and the duel began. We faced each other, swords at the ready. He charged, his blade glowing with the light of a mana chain. He warned me to be careful and launched a swift attack. His sword cut through the air, a blur of motion. But his movements were full of useless flourishes. I easily blocked his attack, and he stared in disbelief. A mana heart shouldn't be able to block a mana chain. He was thrown off balance, stumbling backward. He wondered if it was because he only had one ring. I smirked. It just felt a bit tingly. He was confused. The onlookers murmured in surprise. Was that a sound coming from my sword? My uncle recognized it immediately. Sword resonance. It couldn't be. He lunged at me in a rage, and I was momentarily stunned by his sudden ferocity. Our blades clashed, and he screamed in frustration as I pushed him back. The force of our blows sent a shockwave through the courtyard. He stumbled, panting heavily. He was right. Ring mana and heart mana were incompatible. I could feel a mana backflow threatening to overwhelm me. I asked him if he was the second son of Baron Tailheim. He needed to cool his head a bit. I closed my eyes and focused on my senses, awakening a part of my soul that had long been dormant. Whether it was called a demon sword or a holy sword, it was a part of me. The dormant will to slay dragons awakened, and the memory of the sword and the essence of the heart crafted to slay dragons merged. The dragon slayer's heart was activated. My eyes snapped open, now glowing with a crimson light. An aura of pure power erupted around me, taking the form of a fearsome dragon. This was the true power of the dragon-slaying sword. Taylor stared in terror at the monstrous apparition behind me, wondering what in the world was happening. My uncle shouted for me to stop, but it was too late. I was already moving. Bale's urgent cry to stop echoed across the training ground as he recognized the danger in Adrian's glowing red sword. The intervention was not a surprise, but a request. Before the spars began, Adrian had asked his uncle for a single favor. Should it appear he was about to lose control and deliver a killing blow, Vale was to stop him by any means necessary. Fulfilling that promise, Vale's brilliant blue energy erupted, crashing against Adrian's attack and shattering the very flagstones. While the commander stood firm in the chaotic aftermath, Adrian was sent tumbling back against the castle wall. As Vale sheathed his sword, the royal guards swarmed him, accusing him of treason for striking the prince. With a groan, Adrian pushed himself to his feet, ordering the guards to stand down and explaining that he had asked his uncle to step in. He wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, wryly noting that while he did ask for help, he never specified that getting knocked out was part of the deal, before collapsing once more. Later, in the quiet of his room, his mana heart pulsed with a steady blue glow. He pressed a hand to his chest, the memory of the impact still fresh. He truly thought the heart might crack. His uncle's power was on a completely different level, and he was lucky to have escaped without serious injury. Still, a smile touched his lips. In the end, it was worth it because he had won the duel. A stern voice cut through his thoughts, asking what he was so happy about. Vale had entered his room, demanding an explanation for what he had just witnessed. He questioned the unrighteous sword style Adrian used, a technique he had never taught. Adrian calmly replied that he was merely being faithful to the essence of the sword. Vale scoffed at a boy with no combat experience speaking of such things, yet he conceded that killing intent, while unsettling, was an undeniable truth of swordsmanship. The response surprised Adrian, who had been bracing himself for a tedious lecture on the noble path of the sword. His uncle clarified that he was a soldier, not a knight. He walked the path of victory, not righteousness. He was a true believer in the philosophy of mess around and find out. Even so, he warned Adrian that his sword went too far. Adrian quipped that fixing that was precisely why his uncle was there. Vale crossed his arms, promising to watch closely to see if his nephew would be consumed by his own power. After 3 days of sparring had concluded, Adrian commended Taylor Tailheim for his hard work. He acknowledged the trial of facing his uncontrolled killing intent for so long. Then, unable to resist a jab, he remarked that it must be a shame not to have landed even a single blow. He summoned a maid, who presented a heavy chest to the confused young knight. Adrian explained it was an apology for the past prince's terrible deeds, a gift of gold and a letter for Baron Tailheim. He sent the stunned knight off with a wish for a safe journey. He felt no real obligation to clean up that scoundrel's messes, but he believed in paying for a man's labor. The prince's practice duels became the talk of the kingdom, with nobles eagerly awaiting tales of his downfall. But the news they expected never came. Instead, his opponents spoke of a misunderstanding, praising the prince's sincerity. The baffled gossips could only conclude that the royal family had silenced them. Hearing this, Adrian slammed his fist on a crate in fury. He raged that they weren't silenced, just embarrassed to admit they had lost to him. As he complained about the idle nobles, Vale dryly pointed out that he was one to talk. Adrian recalled grabbing his last opponent, making him promise to spread the correct results. He had been so sure the rumors would finally die down. His confidence shattered when a maid nervously informed him of a new rumor, that His Highness was threatening his opponents to fabricate wins. His brilliant plan had gone up in smoke. Frustrated, he decided to forget it and just train. His aura flared to life as he focused on his swings, his movements growing sharper with each pass. His form was fluid and his strikes were precise, the blade itself glowing with controlled energy. His mana heart burned brightly within his chest. He asked his attendant, Carl, how many challengers were left. Today's was the last, Carl replied. Adrian sighed, bored by the thought of another apprentice knight. But Carl explained that this final opponent was a proper knight who had trained with a knighthood, not just with her family. She was a probation knight of the esteemed Iron Lion Knights. Her name was Arwen Kirgayan. As she approached, the guards recognized her emblem. They whispered her famous titles: the Flower of the Cliff, the Thorny Rose, a beauty said to break the hearts of all men. They stepped back respectfully. They were impressed, admitting the prince had some ability to attract a woman of her caliber. Arwen walked past them, her face a mask of indifference. As she entered the training grounds, the guards snickered, musing on how laughable it would be if the prince was humiliated by that very woman. The Iron Lion Knights were one of the kingdom's most renowned orders, respected for both their fame and skill. Arwen Kirgayan, a probation knight whose official membership was already guaranteed, was one of their most promising talents. Adrian couldn't understand why a genius like her would seek a duel with him. His attendant explained there had been a slight misunderstanding in the past, but Adrian knew better. The old prince had likely picked a fight unilaterally. He grabbed a nearby maid, demanding she tell him what had really happened. The girl hesitated, before nervously explaining that His Highness had harassed Sir Arwen. The revelation sent a jolt of secondhand embarrassment through Adrian, who clutched his head in frustration at the crazy bastard who used to own his body. The maid recounted the incident. The former prince had approached Arwen with a lecherous grin, acknowledging her beauty before offering her a position as his personal maid. When she brushed his hand away, she coolly reminded him that knights were not his private property. The rejection sent the prince into a rage, and he had screamed that she was an ugly thing. Hearing the tale, Adrian could only grimace at the twisted courtship of a rotten scoundrel. It was absurd, especially since no one could possibly look at Arwen and call her ugly. She was, by any measure, stunning. When Arwen arrived, she greeted him formally, remarking that he hadn't changed a bit. Adrian awkwardly replied that he had in fact changed a lot, to the point where a completely different person was inside. Her icy glare was a clear sign that this was his karma to bear. Just then, Count Balahard arrived. Recognizing him, Arwen introduced herself and paid her respects. Vale, foregoing his neutrality as an observer, warned her to be careful of the prince's vicious sword. Adrian could only wonder where his uncle's impartiality had gone. With a curt nod, Val instructed them to take their positions. The duel was set to begin. Arwen immediately took a low stance, ready for battle. Adrian watched her with a smirk, eager to test the skills of the Iron Lion's prospect. She burst forward in a flash of blue energy, her movements impressively quick. Their swords clashed in a shower of sparks. The force of her strike sent a jolt through Adrian, causing his mana to backflow painfully. Her relentless assault kept him on the defensive, forcing him to parry a flurry of blows. He was caught in a storm of steel, unable to find an opening. Each block was a struggle. He realized he was being completely overwhelmed. This wouldn't do. As she pressed her attack, Adrian activated his Dragon Slayer's heart. A flash of crimson appeared in Arwen's eyes as she felt the shift in his aura. He met her next strike with an explosion of red energy, pushing her back for the first time. She quickly retreated to create distance, unnerved by the sudden change in his sword. Adrian smirked, realizing not all single rings were the same. She was on a different level from the others. A new power awakened within him. The authority of judgment became available, displaying Arwen's status. She was an apprentice with high aptitude, a prodigy. But the fact he could see this limited authority meant one crucial thing: she was either weaker than him or of similar strength. With newfound confidence, he declared that the real fight was just beginning. After a fierce exchange, both combatants were left panting. Arwen was equally breathless. They stood apart, catching their breath. Vale watched as the sword fell from his hand. He called a halt to the day's match, announcing they would continue tomorrow. Adrian clicked his tongue, annoyed at being stopped just as he was about to finish it. Arwen retorted with a smirk that she was about to do the same. She challenged him to keep going if he wished. Vale's voice boomed, cutting them off. He declared it was too late and ordered them both to get treated. An overly enthusiastic healer rushed to Adrian's side, pointing out every little bruise with far too much concern. Another healer tended to Arwen. She glanced over, a complicated expression on her face. They turned and walked away from each other, a silent promise of another battle hanging in the air. For 2 more days, the duel continued with no clear winner. The spectators, including Arwen's fellow knights, were surprised. They had heard of Dame Arwen's skill, but the prince was proving to be equally impressive. They hoped for a decisive result soon. On the 3rd day, Adrian stopped her before they began, stating he had something to say. Arwen asked if he was trying to apologize, warning him that she would not accept it. Adrian acknowledged her admirable desire to reclaim her pride with her own power, but clarified that wasn't his intention. He proposed that since they were fighting so fiercely, there should be a prize. He suggested the loser grant the winner one wish, no matter what it was. Arwen was silent for a moment. The spectators were outraged, demanding the prince withdraw such an outrageous statement. Ignoring them, Adrian asked Arwen for her decision. She declared that as a loyal knight, she could not dare commit disrespect against him. However, a sly smile graced her lips as she added that if it was a prize permitted by His Highness, she supposed she was entitled to receive it. Adrian praised her good thinking. With a warning not to go back on his word, the duel resumed. Their blades met with renewed ferocity. Arwen lunged, her teal aura clashing with his. A demonic grin spread across Adrian's face, his eyes glowing red. He unleashed a powerful strike that she barely parried. The speed shocked her. He wasn't this fast yesterday. She wondered if he had been hiding his true strength as a draconic aura manifested behind him. Their swords became a blur of motion, a whirlwind of strikes and parries that sent them both flying back. She cried out as his blade grazed her arm. He pressed his advantage, his red aura surging. Arwen gasped for breath, a cut now visible on her cheek. Adrian channeled his power into a final decisive blow. The attack was a blur of crimson and teal light, ending in a blinding flash. Arwen's sword was sent spinning through the air. She fell to her knees, disarmed and defeated. The onlookers were stunned into silence. Even Vale looked surprised. Arwen stared at the ground in disbelief. Adrian stood over her, breathing heavily. He had won the bet. He called her name, and as she looked up, he gave a slight smile. He stated his prize. He wanted her. Carl never expected his job as the royal guard to the notorious first prince to be easy, but it had been surprisingly straightforward. When he first met the prince, Adrian seemed arrogant but lacked the violent tantrums rumored to define him. The prince was often seen running laps, a sight that defied all expectations. Even in the pouring rain, Adrian trained relentlessly, striking a training dummy with fervor. The other guards, soaked in concern, suggested they stop him. Just as Carl was about to intervene, a bolt of lightning struck perilously close. The training dummy exploded into splinters, yet the prince merely grinned, sweat and rain mixing on his face. At that moment, Carl felt a profound sense of awe. He had a feeling His Highness was destined for greatness. That was, until the duel. When the prince declared his prize was Arwen herself, the other knights gasped in scandalized horror. Carl felt a pit in his stomach, wondering if he had completely misjudged the prince. Arwen, though shaken, found her voice and demanded to know if that was truly what he desired. Adrian callously pointed out that as she was now, she was just an ordinary apprentice who couldn't even defeat a scoundrel like him. With a smirk, he clarified that what he truly wanted was her potential. The future of the knight named Arwen Kirgayan. He needed a knight who followed him, not by decree, but by choice. A knight who belonged only to him. He saw her talent, her aptitude for the sword. Therefore, Arwen Kirgayan, she was to become his knight. Arwen's mind raced back through her training. Despite her striking appearance, which always drew comments, she was never treated as a knight. To prove herself, she worked twice as hard as everyone else. She fought and won, time and time again. She defeated every other apprentice, showcasing her undeniable skill. She produced result after result, but her peers still saw her as a poster girl, her beauty overshadowing her achievements. She could never truly become a knight in their eyes, but now the prince wanted her for her potential as a knight. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. Was he being sincere? She had one condition. She asked him to promise to treat her not as a woman but as a knight. If he did that, she would do as he wished. Their eyes met in a moment of silent understanding. Adrian agreed to her terms. With a decisive step, Arwen knelt before him. She, Arwen, eldest daughter of the Kergaian family, wore her loyalty to Prince Adrian Leonberg, dedicating her sword and her life to his service. Vale watched the proceedings with a stoic expression. As a legitimate heir of Leonberg, Adrian dubbed her a knight, instructing her to be brave, courteous, and loyal. The oath sent ripples of gossip through the knighthood. They couldn't believe she would swear loyalty to that scoundrel over a bet and plotted to nullify the oath. Rumors flew, suggesting a secret relationship or that the prince was using the oath as a cover to take her as a mistress. Hearing the whispers, Adrian exploded in frustration. He wasn't a villain, he was just trying to recruit a knight. He ranted about being seen as the worst scum on earth while Carl stood by silently. The guard finally spoke, bringing up something the prince had said on the final day of the duel. He reminded Adrian of his desire for a knight not bound by royal decree. Adrian asked if his words had upset him, pointing out that Carl would leave if a decree ordered him elsewhere. He then cheekily offered Carl the chance to make the oath too. Carl asked if he would accept it. The prince's answer was a blunt no. He didn't want him, explaining there was no joy in raising Carl. He wanted to find gems, not just polished rocks. Carl could only laugh it off. Adrian insisted he was serious. Later, a letter arrived, officially releasing Adrian from his probation and summoning him to a royal banquet. The prince was baffled. His probation had been lifted a month and a half early. After the king had acted as if he never wanted to see him again, Adrian couldn't fathom what the man was thinking. He told his maid he didn't care. He had nowhere to go and no one to see. Just then, the maid remembered another invitation had arrived. An invitation? She presented a lavishly decorated card. It was from a social club for special young lords. Adrian was surprised to learn he was a member. He asked if it was a weird place. The maid tactfully explained that the refined tastes of young lords were incomprehensible to her, hinting at wild parties. Adrian dismissed it as a useless gathering for booze and women, tossing the invitation aside. But as it fell, he caught the signature, Bernardo of the Eli family. Eli? He remembered the name. His uncle had told him of the Eli family, who clung to the old Monahart system until they fell into ruin a century ago. Intrigued, Adrian decided to attend the gathering after all. He held the invitation, hoping the family hadn't completely fallen from grace just yet. 4 months had passed since Gruhorn took over the prince's body and began his intense training. A tailor, beaming with pride, presented the new outfit he had made. A simple, black design with minimal embellishments, just as instructed. Though plain, the tailor gushed that the prince's majestic dignity remained. Looking in the mirror, Adrian noted he had certainly lost a lot of weight. The tailor confirmed his measurements had decreased by more than half. Adrian then commissioned another outfit for the upcoming palace banquet, but told the eager tailor to wait. His measurements, he explained with a smirk, would change again by then. A few days later, he was on his way to the social club for special young lords. Carl rode alongside the ornate carriage. Inside, Adrian yawned, finding the life of a prince utterly exhausting. The clothes, the carriage, the guards, it was all so stifling. His gaze fell on his maid, and he noticed a faint scar on her neck. When he asked about it, she simply said it was from her own incompetence, a punishment for something he had rightly reprimanded her for. The thought of the old prince's cruelty made him shudder. The more he learned about this body's past, the more horror stories he uncovered. It struck him that he had seen this maid for months but didn't even know her name. He asked her directly. She introduced herself as Adelia Byron. The name was familiar. He recalled a time long ago, before cities and kingdoms, when weak humans were preyed upon by other races. A great war ended that miserable history, and the saviors who led humanity to dominance were granted the title of the Five Electors. One of those 5 heroes was his comrade, a red-haired woman named Agnes. He remembered her asking him what they would do after the war. She stood alone against hordes of giants, her resolve unshakable. With a single brilliant flash of her sword, she leaped into battle, beheading Ida, the king of giants, and ending the long era of exploitation. That legendary hero was the iron-blooded sword marquis, Agnes Bayern. He remembered her smile, her face streaked with dirt and blood, surrounded by the bodies of her enemies. He also remembered her colorful language, her eyes flashing with fury as she cursed the giant's vile habits. She had a surprisingly foul mouth, a fact he found endlessly amusing. Her passionate rants were something to behold. The memory alone was enough to make his ears burn. To think that this quiet maid was a descendant of that same fiery Byron, he wondered what could have possibly happened to her family to bring them to this state. His thoughts were interrupted as Carl announced their arrival. When the prince didn't immediately move, Carl called his name again. Adrian stepped out of the carriage. He strode past his guard, telling Adelia they would talk later, leaving her and Carl looking puzzled. A young man with white hair greeted him with a flourish. Bernardo of the Eli family expressed his joy at seeing the prince safe and sound. Adrian sized him up. For a descendant of the Eli family, he looked like a punk. Bernardo lamented how much weight the prince had lost, which only drew a smirk from Adrian. When Bernardo asked if he was unwell, Adrian replied that he was glad he came. Today, he told him, would be very entertaining. Bernardo was left confused. Inside, the club was a den of debauchery. Young lords bragged about their conquests, their hands roaming freely over the women beside them. Adrian sat apart, sipping wine. Bernardo watched him, finding his behavior strange. Normally, the prince would be dead drunk and flirting with everyone by now. His entire aura felt different. Another lord approached Adrian, his words slurred. He'd heard the rumors about him plucking the flower of the Iron Lion. Adrian remained silent. The lord drunkenly complained that he'd had his eye on Arwen for a while and should have gotten her oath first. He leered, wondering what she looked like under her armor. Adrian's voice cut through the lord's disgusting monologue. He asked if the man had any siblings. Bernardo, confused, reminded him that he had a younger brother. Adrian replied that it was a relief. Before the drunken lord could process what was happening, Adrian's fist connected with his jaw. The man went down with a sickening crack, landing in a heap of shattered glass and spilled wine. The room fell silent, the partygoers staring in shock. Even Bernardo was stunned. Adrian looked at Bernardo and said it was a relief his family line wouldn't end with him. He then delivered a swift kick to the down lord's jewel. The room erupted into chaos. Adrian stood amidst the wreckage and declared that from now on, Bernardo's younger brother was the heir to House Eli. Adrian continued his brutal assault, punching and kicking the nobles into submission. The remaining partygoers watched in stunned silence, flinching with every blow. He grabbed one of the men by his collar, who sputtered in confusion, asking why the prince was doing this. With a bruised and swollen face, the man listened as Adrian spoke. He could tolerate being thought of as a scoundrel, but he would not be treated like one. The nobles were completely bewildered by his words. Adrian clarified his meaning by delivering another savage punch. He moved through the room with brutal efficiency, leaving a trail of unconscious body in his wake. The last man standing was left twitching on the floor. Adrian then turned his attention to Bernardo Eli, who immediately fell to his knees in terror. Adrian reminded him of his earlier promise of an entertaining day. Bernardo trembled, wondering why this crazy bastard was suddenly acting like this. Adrian ordered him to summon the royal knights. Bernardo scrambled to his feet and rushed to obey. In the quiet aftermath, Adrian stood amidst the chaos. Blood spattered on his cheek. He ordered the women to leave, but one of the remaining lords hesitated. As the man tried to sneak away, Adrian's cold voice stopped him. He warned the man that if he chose to leave, he would be leaving as a woman. The threat was clear, and the remaining men froze in terror. Adrian walked through the room, his voice dripping with contempt. He pointed out that none of them had shown a prince the proper respect, instead mocking him to his face and insulting his knight. He turned to the doorway where the royal knights had just arrived and asked what charges could be applied. Carl, standing among them, listed them off. Insult to royalty for looking down on him, and challenging the authority of the royal family, which was tantamount to treason. The knights stood ready, asking who they should force to their knees. With a chilling smile, Adrian simply said, "Everyone." Later, back at the palace, the king admonished him for causing a scene the moment his probation was lifted. 14 noble children had been arrested under charges of insult to royalty and treason. The king demanded to know if Adrian realized what he had done. He explained that while the authority of the royal family demanded severe punishment, the potential backlash from 14 families could not be ignored. Adrian asked if his father was truly worried about that. He pointed out that the arrested nobles were outcasts in their own families, irredeemable trash who only tarnished their reputations. He suggested sending a letter. When the king asked to whom, Adrian pointed out the obvious: the brothers and sisters of the arrested scoundrels, who would be more than happy to handle the internal noise. The king was left speechless. He dismissed Adrian, who left with a cheerful yes sir tilde. Back in his room, Adrian tried to reassure a terrified Adelia, telling her not to be nervous. She burst into tears, begging to know what she had done wrong. He realized the old prince must have tormented her terribly. Adelia explained that her family barely managed to make it onto the list of nobles. Even she, a direct descendant, knew nothing of the great hero Bayern. Her family's glorious history had been erased. All that remained was a fractured legacy. Their prestige and pride had vanished without a trace. Using his authority, Adrian saw her status. She had S-rank swordsmanship and A-rank mana sensitivity, but her traits were a chaotic mix: butcher, war maniac, fragile heart, caregiver, and slave mentality. He was shocked. What kind of combination was that? A mad woman obsessed with battle who goes crazy at the sight of blood, yet also tender-hearted, skilled at caregiving, and possessing a dependent, passive personality. She had unrivaled talent, but not a single trait to control her madness. He wondered if it was truly okay to unleash this upon the world. It was a gamble, but he had to try. An S-rank talent was too good to pass up. He noticed one trait he could exploit: slave mentality, the joy of serving a master with all one's heart. He called her name and commanded her to swear her loyalty to him. She was stunned, asking what he meant. He told her to become his knight, to swear it right there, right now. She fell to her knees, insisting she couldn't handle such a thing. He reminded her that her family was insignificant and promised to take responsibility for them. In return, she would swear loyalty and serve him as her master. If she couldn't control her madness, he would hold the reins for her. She tearfully asked if he would truly take responsibility for her family. He confirmed it. He even offered to summon them to the capital so she could see them any time. Overjoyed, she agreed. Adelia, eldest daughter of the Bayern family, swore her loyalty to Prince Adrian Leonberg, vowing to serve him as her master for her entire life. He placed a hand on her head in acknowledgement. From now on, she would obey his orders unconditionally. She replied, "As you command." As she looked up, her eyes held a disturbing gleam of adoration. For a moment, he wondered if this was the right choice. Rumors of the first prince's return to his scoundrel-like ways spread like wildfire. Not only had he coerced a knight's loyalty, but he'd also beaten and imprisoned noble children. Now he was making a common maid a personal knight, clearly building a harem. Adrian wondered when everyone had become so interested in him. He'd only taken on one new knight, yet from the moment he woke up, everyone had an opinion. His father, the king, was developing a headache from cleaning up the political mess, only for his son to indulge in women. His uncle Vale called him pathetic, questioning if he'd given up on their bet entirely. Even his brother found it amusingly typical that he would appoint a maid as a knight. Adrian sighed, exasperated at how quickly gossip traveled. Just then, a maid announced the queen's arrival, and Adrian slumped in his chair in frustration. His mother entered, expressing her disappointment that he was returning to his old ways after showing such promise. However, she saw this as an opportunity. The queen, with the strategic subtlety of a charging mammoth, decided the solution to her son's wandering eye was to give him a permanent target. She declared with fierce determination that she would find him a suitable spouse this time. Adrian was left utterly speechless by the turn of events. Later, Adelia timidly asked if she would now gain mana. Adrian confirmed that she would gain a very special kind. He focused his energy, recalling the legacy of the sword Marquis, Agnes Bayard. He remembered her footsteps, the dance of her sword, and the magnificent beating of her heart, channeling that very essence into the girl before him. Golden light enveloped Adelia as the imprinting began. A series of notifications confirmed the process. Adelia had sensed mana. It had been successfully imprinted, and it had settled within her body. Her eyes widened in shock, feeling a new power as a mana heart formed within her. Adrian explained the technique and told her to practice it whenever she had time. The effort, however, left him suddenly drained and stumbling. Adelia cried out in alarm, asking if he was all right. He waved off her concern, claiming he was merely tired. Adelia, confused by his efforts for someone so lowly, simply stared. When he asked why she was looking at him that way, she bowed deeply, intensely vowing to serve him with loyalty for the rest of her life. He smirked, reminding her simply not to forget that he was her master. She agreed enthusiastically. He was genuinely afraid she might forget, especially with her particular disposition. A few days later, Carl reported that Bernardo Eli was being held as a witness by the royal guard. He would be unavailable until the trial began. Adrian was surprised a trial was even happening, but was relieved to hear royalty was exempt from attending, which he considered excellent news. He mused that they were blowing the incident out of proportion. He turned his attention to Adelia, asking if her mana heart had stabilized. She confirmed it had. It was time for her to join his training. He told her to change her clothes and meet him at the training grounds, reminding her to put down the cleaning rag. She was a knight now. At the training grounds, Adrian was warming up when Vale appeared, demanding to know what he was doing. Adrian said he was warming up, but Vale clarified he was referring to the girl running laps, Adelia. Adrian nonchalantly confirmed the rumors. He was making her a knight. Vale was furious, asking if the title of knight was so trivial to him. Adrian snapped back, questioning when his uncle had become such a busybody. He told Vale that if he hated it so much, he should stop coming. Just then, Adelia collapsed, having completed her 10 laps. Both men fell silent. She apologized for causing a disturbance, but Adrian simply tossed her a wooden sword, announcing he would teach her the basic stance. He demonstrated a single, fluid swing and told her to try. She awkwardly mimicked the position. Suddenly, her eyes sharpened with focus, and she perfectly replicated his swing with astonishing power. Vale watched in disbelief. Adrian was stunned that she had copied it so perfectly after a single demonstration. She asked if her stance was correct, but Adrian was already spiraling. He realized with a jolt of fear that she would surpass him in no time. Her slave mentality meant submission to the strong, a terrifying thought considering the original prince's past abuse. An image of a stronger Adelia turning on him flashed through his mind. Val, however, looked intrigued, recognizing her immense talent. He asked what he thought he was doing. Adrian shot back, warning him not to covet her. Vale scoffed, questioning what a novice like Adrian could possibly offer a prodigy. He asserted that a beginner who had only held a sword for a few months could not handle her. His powerful aura flared, pressing down on the prince. The old Adrian would have backed down immediately, but he was not him. His mana heart roared to life. He knew that if he couldn't handle her, then no one could, for he was the soul that had drunk the blood of kings and dragons, the legendary sword Gruhorn. A portion of that soul manifested in response to his will. Red aura flared around him as his eyes glowed with power. He faced his uncle, undeterred. She was mine. A possessive aura flared around Adrian as he faced his uncle. He warned Vale not to look at or covet Adelia, stating with cold fury that he hated it when someone tried to take what was his. Vale stood silently, taken aback by the sheer intensity emanating from the prince. For a moment, Adrian's vision swam. His sense of reality began to fade, replaced by a sensation of cold, dark emptiness where he could feel no life. It felt like an omen. At this rate, he knew the weak body of the prince would be utterly consumed by the ancient, overwhelming soul of Gruhorn. He could feel its malevolent will reaching for him, 1,000 hungry hands pulling him into the abyss. He fought against the pull, struggling to maintain his own consciousness. With a surge of will, he decided that was enough. He mentally pushed back the encroaching darkness, and his aura shifted from menacing red back to a controlled blue as he planted his feet firmly on the training ground. Vale, a hardened commander, saw Adelia's potential differently. He knew an ordinary knight could save 10 soldiers, and an outstanding one could save 100. He believed a prodigy like Adelia could save thousands. He saw her talent through the lens of conviction, a great cause for the northern frontier. Adrian, however, simply did not care. Vale was aghast, questioning if the prince's selfishness outweighed the countless lives she could save. But before the argument could continue, Adelia stepped forward. She placed a hand over her heart and declared that her body and soul already belonged to His Highness. She could not follow the Count's words. Vale was left speechless. Adrian smirked, satisfied. It was worth the effort of dragging his soul out. Her slave mentality trait was working perfectly, binding her to the one she saw as a higher power. He turned back to his uncle, asking if he had anything left to teach, reminding him that the original goal was just weight loss. He then issued an ultimatum. If Vale wished to keep visiting, he was not to interfere in Adrian's affairs again. Reluctantly, Vale agreed. Even so, his uncle continued to visit the palace without fail, solely to watch Adelia's training. Adrian found it quite entertaining to see the arrogant man squirm, forbidden from nagging or interfering. During one session, Adrian noticed a change. A golden aura flickered around Adelia's wooden sword. Vale's eyes widened in shock. Adrian was just as surprised, wondering if she had already learned sword resonance. He clapped enthusiastically, praising her good work. He felt a nervous sweat. At this rate, she might actually overtake him. Vale stormed over, demanding to know if Adrian had also taught her the mana heart. When Adrian casually confirmed it, asking if something was wrong, Vale exploded. He raged, asking if it wasn't enough for Adrian alone to learn such a cheap trick. A cold silence fell over the training ground. Adrian told him to get out. Vale insisted there was a much better path for her, that Adrian had ruined her unimaginable potential. Adrian ordered Carl to escort him out. Vale stopped him, saying he would leave on his own, and stalked away. Adelia looked downcast, asking if what she had learned was truly a cheap trick. Adrian reassured her that it absolutely was not. She wondered why the Count spoke of it with such disdain, and Adrian explained it was because he simply didn't know. The people of this era had forgotten what a real mana heart was like. If they hadn't, they never would have discarded it like a pair of old shoes. He promised she would soon see its true power. The next day, a training sword slammed into the ground. Vale had returned. He told Adrian to prove it. He would use only a single mana ring, and if Adrian could push him back even half a step, he would acknowledge him. Adrian grabbed the wooden sword, a grin spreading across his face. He recalled their original bet. Was a wish on the line? Vale confirmed that if Adrian won, he would grant one wish, even offering to pass down his family's secret technique. But Adrian wasn't interested in that. For now, he just wanted to fight, and he lunged forward. Vale easily parried the first strike, noting Adrian still aimed for the neck. He called the prince's swordsmanship as venomous as ever as he dodged another blow. Adrian pressed his attack, unleashing a flurry of strikes which Vale met with ease. Their swords locked. Vale, unimpressed, asked if this was all he had. The force of his block sent Adrian stumbling back, skidding across the dirt. Vale asked if he had given up already. Adrian laughed it off. He admitted his uncle was strong. He knew that with his mana heart at its current level, he would certainly lose as his uncle intended. But he posed a question. 400 years ago, countless mana heart knights achieved unbelievable feats. Yet, because one new, somewhat useful technique appeared, all the arts of those great knights were now treated as trash. Vale asked what he was trying to say. Adrian's thoughts were different. Just because it was a mana heart didn't mean they were all the same. He asked his uncle if he had ever heard of the martial spirit hymn. Val scoffed, stating this was a place for crossing swords, not for such ear-tickling discussions. Adrian expected that response, but his uncle just told him he talked too much. Ignoring the jab, Adrian's eyes began to glow with blue light. The path a knight walks becomes an achievement. His 100 victories in sparring were his pride and his power. He would sing of those victories won against 20 trainees. That achievement was engraved in his heart, becoming a martial spirit hymn. A notification announced the creation of the common rank martial spirit hymn, which now dwelled within his sword. It was a small achievement, but it was his. As the hymn's effect activated, his entire being was flooded with power. This, he declared, was the true power of the mana heart. As the ship activated, flooding Adrian with power, Vale remained unimpressed. He stated that as long as Adrian possessed a mana heart, he could never defeat the mana chain. With his power surging, Adrian charged. Their wooden swords clashed with explosive force. Valen knew that the mana from his rings would cause a backflow in Adrian's mana heart, and he felt the disruption begin as their blades met. He smirked, confident in the outcome. He complimented Adrian's stubborn endurance but knew it was ultimately futile. Adrian, however, was prepared. To obtain this hymn he had sparred over 100 times, withstanding the mana of the rings 1,000 times over. It was a power specifically forged to deal with ring-wielding knights. While clashing 100 times, he endured 1,000 waves of their disruptive energy. His body was now conditioned to resist it. This was the power of his His sword glowed with a stable, potent light. Now, he thought, this was worth a try. He launched himself forward again, and their swords met in a flurry of rapid strikes, a blur of blue energy and splintering wood. Adrian pressed the attack with a fierce grin. Vale was surprised he had lasted this long. He reinforced his own sword with mana and met Adrian's assault head-on, the force of their blows finally pushing Adrian back. The prince stood his ground, bruised but determined. Vale was stunned, wondering how this was possible. Adrian simply reminded him that not all mana hearts were the same. His uncle, enraged by this arrogance, stomped his foot and charged forward, unleashing a powerful, decisive strike. The impact sent a shockwave through the training ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. Vale stood tall, declaring he would stop playing around. Adrian's endurance had been commendable enough, but as he looked at the beaten prince, Adrian knew a normal-grade hymn was insufficient. He pushed himself up, leaning on his sword. 400 years ago, he explained, the knights of old made a grave mistake. They were so thorough in their conquest that they left no worthy enemies for their descendants. At first, everything was passed down intact. The sword techniques, the methods of refining the heart, and the shining martial spirit hymns. But time, that sneaky little thief, gnawed away at those achievements, causing them to be forgotten. Tales of dragons and giant kings became absurd legends, like something out of a children's book. Of course, new hymns were created, but they were based on lesser feats, victories against a handful of knights or 100 soldiers. These hymns, built against humans alone, failed to achieve myth or grade, and could not withstand the new wind that was the mana chain. A technique like that, he scoffed, could never reach true transcendence. Vale, utterly baffled, asked if Adrian had been day drinking. Adrian ignored him, calling him an arrogant and foolish knight. He declared that they all needed to know just how great a thing they had lost. A dark, menacing aura began to swirl around him, the dormant power of the Dragon Slayer stirring within. If they did not know, he would teach them. He would show them the power that no treasured sword could cut, the might required to split a dragon's scales and drink its hot blood. He began to sing the Paeline of true dragon slaying. A system warning flashed. His current body couldn't handle the grade of the hymn. As his body screamed in protest, large portions of the hymn were automatically omitted. He was left with only a single, fragmented verse. Splitting the dragon's scales. He unleashed the technique. His dark, crimson-infused strike slammed against Vale's defense. Vale felt his own mana being overwhelmed, realizing with dawning horror that at this rate he would be devoured. He poured all his power into a single ring to defend himself. The resulting explosion threw Adrian backward, and Adelia cried out in alarm. When the dust settled, Adrian was on the ground, battered but smirking. He looked up at his uncle, who now had all 4 of his mana rings activated. Adrian pointed out that Vale was supposed to use only 1. Despite using all 4, he had still failed to prevent his wooden sword from being severed. Adrian slowly got to his feet. It was an undeniable truth that the mana from the heart was inferior to the mana from the ring. But that didn't matter. He looked his uncle in the eye and declared, "You lost." Fragments of a nightmare flickered through Adrian's mind. A monstrous dragon, the taste of blood, and his own soul screaming for it to stop. He saw his own hand, no longer human, but a cold, unfeeling sword. He woke with a gasp, begging for the visions to end, clutching his chest as the last vestiges of the dream faded. He found himself back in his bed, exhausted, his hands trembling. He cursed the damn martial spirit him. This was the price for forcefully drawing out the power of splitting the dragon's scales, a technique born from a myth-grade him. His body was a wreck, but he knew the risk had been worth it. He sat up, feeling the new power settle within him. It was the first martial spirit hymn he had woven himself, a testament to his own strength. He had endured 1,000 waves of disruptive mana during 100 duels, and now he could stand tall before even greater challenges. A notification confirmed that his had grown slightly stronger. He smirked, feeling this would be more than enough for the third prince. Adelia rushed to his side, relieved that he had finally regained consciousness. She explained that it had been total chaos after he collapsed him. She'd never seen the queen so angry. Adrian chuckled, thinking they deserved it. Adelia added that Count Balerhard had left a message, asking to be notified when he woke up. Adrian told her not to report it yet, deciding to rest for a while. He needed to recover his spirit, which had been damaged by the overuse of the hymn. If he didn't, reality and memory would blur into a chaotic mess until the boundary between them collapsed entirely, turning him into a madman endlessly reenacting battles within a shattered world. The thought of being trapped in the sword's memories again after finally becoming human made him shudder. A few days later, while eating, Adrian thought of Agnes Bayern, Adelia's ancestor and a truly great swordswoman. He told Adelia that as her descendant, she should be able to inherit the martial spirit him Agnes left behind. Adelia was amazed to learn of her ancestor's legacy. Adrian added that she would need to grow much stronger to be worthy of such a hymn. He then asked her a direct question. What did she want to do by learning the sword? Adelia hesitated. If she could truly become a knight, what would she do then? She became flustered, unable to articulate her thoughts. Adrian told her to think about it and tell him later. As she turned to leave, she stopped and declared with newfound resolve that she would become His Highness's sword. Adrian was momentarily taken aback by her simple, heartfelt oath. Some hymns of martial deeds begin with the sound of a charging trumpet or the first step across a battlefield. Others, however, begin with a heartfelt oath, just like the one Adelia had just made. A golden light erupted from her, and a notification appeared. Adelia Bayern had dedicated the pious subordination. He wondered if this was her martial spirit hymn. Sometimes a hymn can influence others as well. As her power washed over him, a new martial spirit hymn was created within him. The magistrate was less a martial hymn and more an oath of submission that bound their souls together. To think a descendant of the fiery sword marquis would weave a hymn of subordination was quite the twist, even with her slave mentality. Still, it was unexpected, but welcome. Help. As long as he was the target of her hymn, her growth would benefit him as well. He thanked her sincerely, leaving her blushing and flustered, though he wasn't yet sure what form that benefit would take. A few days later, Adrian sat in his throne room looking thoroughly bored, with Carl and Adelia standing guard. His mother, the queen, entered and asked if her Ian was feeling any better. Adrian found it was always easier to deal with those who hated him. Someone who cherished the original owner of this body was just awkward to handle. The queen asked if he resented his uncle for the duel. She insisted Vale never meant to harm him and urged him to let go of any bad feelings. The queen grew emotional, refusing to believe he wasn't upset after how roughly Vale had treated him. Adrian, feeling a bit awkward, assured her he truly held no grudge. He had already landed a significant blow that day, denying his uncle's pride and everything he held as truth. The man was probably having a harder time than he was. He had planted an inner demon within Vale. If Vale could overcome it, he would grow stronger. If not, he would lose everything. Honestly, Adrian didn't much care either way. The queen, ever the doting mother, explained that her brother had always been closer to the sword than to people. Even so, she said, Vale had recently seemed quite proud of him. He had even persuaded the king himself to lift Adrian's probation early, something Adrian was surprised to hear. But as soon as the probation was lifted, trouble started. She explained that his uncle's position must have been difficult, which was why he acted so disapprovingly. Adrian considered this, but it still left him wondering why the man would do that for him. An old scholar named Niccolo Marchiadel greeted the prince with a warm smile. Adrian, however, immediately refused whatever he was offering, much to the nervous confusion of Carl and Adelia. He threw himself onto the floor in a dramatic tantrum, questioning why he had to study. Niccolo calmly replied that without learning, there was little difference between a human and a beast. Adrian shot up, offended, asking if he was being called a beast. The scholar explained that since the prince had only just begun his studies, he couldn't be called a beast just yet. Adrian fumed that he hadn't even started, accusing the old man of playing word games. He insisted he already knew everything he needed to know. Niccolo, unfazed, proposed a deal. They would discuss a few topics, and if the prince's skills were truly as he claimed, the scholar would no longer visit. Adrian grinned, liking the sound of that. The discussion began with politics. Adrian argued that one must always watch their back, as it was human nature to walk all over those who were too lenient. Nicolo agreed wholeheartedly, and presented Adrian with a book titled Theory of the Iron-Blooded Monarch. The book evaluated the relationship between a ruler and a subject as a contract, a transaction of support and protection. Adrian found it made sense, as all relationships were about give and take. Their discussion continued for hours, stretching into the evening. Finally, the scholar gathered his books, and suggested they continue the next day. Adrian, thoroughly engrossed, happily agreed, waving goodbye with a smile. A moment later, he realized with a jolt that he had just been tricked into a normal lesson. He had to admit the old man was sly. As Nicolo left, he mused that the first prince was quite different from the rumors, possessing a sharp mind hidden beneath a boorish exterior. Lying on his bed under the bright sun, Adrian sighed. He was utterly bored. He wondered if he had been living too diligently lately. With his body still recovering, there was nothing to do. A knock at the door announced a visitor. Sir Vale Ballarhard. Adrian excitedly told the maid to let him in. It had been a few days since their duel, so he was expecting a visit. However, as his uncle entered, Adrian could see he hadn't overcome the inner demon Adrian had planted at all. Vale stood in silence for a moment, then apologized. He admitted he had broken his promise and caused great injury, for which he had no excuses. Adrian's conscience pricked him. The reason he had to recover wasn't because of his uncle's attack, but because he'd overused the dragon-slaying hymn. His mother's words about his uncle's difficult position also echoed in his mind. Vale told him to state his desire, offering his own arm or eye if asked. Adrian scoffed, asking what he was supposed to do with junk like that. He couldn't believe a man who would have been a sword master in the old days was so caught up in his own melodrama. He sighed and decided to be generous. He stated his wish. He wanted to go on an outing. Vale was confused, pointing out that his probation was over. Adrian clarified he wanted a real trip, somewhere far away, outside the capital. His uncle stood in silence. He explained it would take time to arrange, especially with the upcoming banquet. Adrian said that was fine. Vale agreed to contact him once the schedule was set. As his uncle left, Carl stared after him. When Adrian asked why he was staring, Carl admitted it was unexpected. He had thought the prince would demand something far more unreasonable, given that the count had broken his promise. Adrian confessed that seeing the stubborn old man act so dejected made him feel bad. Carl chuckled, earning a sharp rebuke from the prince for looking too comfortable. Just then, Adelia entered, announcing that a letter he was waiting for had arrived. It was sealed with a familiar crest. The letter was from Arwen Kirgayan. She wrote that she had recently achieved a small accomplishment and would be able to visit him soon. Adrian smiled. It was just the right news at the right time. 5 days later, his uncle sent word that the trip was arranged. 2 days after that, the day of departure arrived. Riding in a carriage, Adrian popped his head out the window, asking his uncle where they were stopping. Vale, annoyed, told him to stay inside and he would explain. Their destination was Ellen County, the royal court's greatest production site for weaponry, rich with iron mines and artisan smiths. More than half the royal family's weapons came from there. Adrian was delighted. His cultivation had improved, and it was time he found a proper sword of his own. He had planned to just grab one from the royal armory, but after the original prince's antics, the king had issued a royal decree forbidding him from being issued any weapons. He'd been yamcha'd by his own father. Considering the prince's track record, it was only natural, but it meant he had to find a weapon outside the palace. Adrian, watching his uncle's excited plotting, thought to himself that he was surprisingly thoughtful despite his appearance. The journey of 20 days had just begun. The journey was mapped out plainly. First, a 3-day trip to Ellen County, followed by another 2 days to Iron Lion Castle. Adrian was currently enduring the first leg of this trip, stuck inside a carriage for what felt like an eternity. His traveling companion was Adelia, whose conversational skills were limited to yes or no, making her about as engaging as a chatbot running on dial-up. Sighing with boredom, he decided to make better use of the time and check on his mana heart. It had been completely drained after his duel with Vale, and it was high time to refill it. He closed his eyes and began to meditate, drawing in the latent energy around him. He absorbed the rattling vibration of the carriage wheels, the cool breeze slipping through the window, and even the distant voices of the knights on patrol. Gathering these scattered specks of mana, he funneled them into his empty heart. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open in surprise. His mana heart wasn't just refilling, it had grown immensely. A series of notifications flooded his mind, explaining that forcibly using the dragon-slaying hymn had pushed him beyond his limits, causing his spiritual core to expand. This expansion had fundamentally changed his body's constitution, allowing him to endure far more mana. He had officially reached the stage of a sword expert. Furthermore, his connection to his origin had strengthened, lifting some restrictions on his soul's authority. His third eye and third ear had significantly improved, a fact confirmed by a sudden jolt of heightened awareness. Adelia, noticing his sudden movement, timidly asked if he was all right. Still processing the upgrade, Adrian could only grin. He had taken another great leap forward. They soon arrived at the grand estate of Ellen County. Adrian was met by Lord Edgar and his son Torrance, who offered their formal greetings, which were soon followed by those of his son. Edgar thanked them for their hospitality and offered to guide the prince to his room after the long journey. As he was led through the mansion, Adrian noted that while the halls were filled with weapons, they were all low-grade, flashy items unsuitable for real combat. He walked past the displays with a growing sense of disappointment, realizing he wouldn't find what he was looking for here. He turned to Edgar and inquired about the location of the local blacksmith's guild, stating his desire to look around there. Edgar guided him out of the mansion, explaining that blacksmiths were a rough and stubborn lot. He warned Adrian that they often ignored even the local lord, and spoke crudely, asking the prince to show generosity and chalk it up to their craftsman's spirit. The moment they entered the guild's forge, the intense heat and sound were overwhelming, with furnaces roaring and hammers ringing against anvils. The noise of striking iron filled the air. Edgar, noticing the prince stumble slightly, asked if he was all right, but Adrian was captivated by the symphony of the forge, the clamoring flames, the hissing bellows, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Among the chaos, his newly enhanced senses picked out one exceptionally clear, perfect sound. He was drawn to it, his gaze falling upon an old, master blacksmith working with intense focus. The sound sparked something deep within him. It was the echo of his very first memory, the moment of his own forging. Overwhelmed by the sensation, he began to sweat, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. Adelia gently wiped his face with a handkerchief, asking if he was all right. He mumbled a quiet acknowledgement, snapping out of his trance. Just then, the work in the forge came to a halt as the guild members were brought forward to greet him. Edgar introduced the guild leader, Zaxxon. However, the old master continued to work, completely ignoring the prince's arrival. Zaxxon erupted in anger, shouting at the old man to stop and bow immediately. Before the guild leader could continue, Adrian clamped a hand over his mouth, silencing him. The other blacksmiths looked on nervously. Adrian's eyes fell on the glowing piece of iron on the master's anvil. He admonished Zaxxon for doing something he hadn't ordered, and told the assembled smiths that their iron would cool if they just stood around. His words sent them scrambling back to their stations. With the forge back in full swing, Adrian stood silently, watching the old master work. The rhythmic hammering continued, and Adrian felt a strange resonance with the process. The fire of the forge reflected in his eyes as he stood amidst the flames and sparks, completely absorbed by the master's craft. The familiar yet profoundly new sensation washed over him again, leaving him to wonder what this feeling truly was. As Adrian watched the master smith, Edgar explained the old man's peculiar obsession. For the last 6 months, he had been forging and then melting down swords. Adrian wondered if they were failures, but Edgar confessed it was hard to say. The man was known as the master smith of swords, and every blade he created was said to be a masterpiece. Edgar admitted that even to his eyes, the swords had seemed flawless, making it a complete mystery why they were destroyed. He added that for the past month, the smith had barely slept, clinging only to his work. Given his age, the guild was understandably worried. Adrian quietly absorbed this, recognizing the dedication of a true craftsman. Several days passed in this manner. Adrian would arrive at the forge early and leave late, simply observing. The old man continued his work without a word, and the prince merely watched him in silence. To Edgar's surprise, the feared prince's visit passed without a single incident, and the nights went by peacefully. Finally, the day of Adrian's departure arrived. He watched the smith, still hammering away, a hint of disappointment on his face. He had hoped to see the work completed before he left. As he stood there silently, he felt a deep regret. His guard, Carl, reminded him it was time to go, mentioning a farewell party before their early morning departure. Edgar felt a pang of sympathy, understanding the prince's desire to witness the sword's completion. Just as Adrian turned to leave, a frantic shout broke the air. Edgar came running, announcing that the master smith had finished the sword. Adrian looked up, stunned by the sight of the sky, which seemed to glow with the forge's final fire. There, against the sunset, stood the old man, holding his creation. He gave the blade a final wipe, its surface gleaming brilliantly. The master smith then knelt before Adrian, dedicating the sword he had poured his soul into directly to the prince. The onlookers gasped in shock. The scene felt like a passage from the ancient Song of the Smiths, describing a blade heated like the rising sun and cooled to the color of a king's robes, a sword fit for royalty. Adrian asked if it had a name. The smith, exhausted, suggested twilight. He explained that for him it was the dusk of his life, but for the prince it was the dawn of a new era. Adrian laughed, remarking that the smith was surprisingly eloquent. The old man smiled faintly, then collapsed, murmuring that it was a relief. He had passed out from sheer exhaustion. Adrian caught the old man, telling Carl to inform his uncle he would be spending the night at the forge. That night, guards stood watch outside a makeshift tent where Adrian sat by the master's bedside. The smith, awake but weak, confided that the sword had taken shape as if by destiny the moment Adrian stood behind him. Adrian asked if he believed the sword had chosen its own day to be born. Leaning close, Adrian whispered a truth known to none. The smith's eyes widened in utter disbelief. He realized who, or rather, what, Adrian truly was. Adrian confirmed it, explaining that as a fellow creation he understood the sword's heart. The old man let out a long breath, a look of profound understanding on his face. With his last bit of strength, he asked to hold the sword one more time. Adrian handed it to him. The smith gripped the hilt tightly, praying that the blade would become as great as its new master, a wielder who was himself a legendary weapon. Adrian watched him solemnly, then placed his hand over the smith's, promising that it certainly would. His expression was resolute. He sat with the master through the night, and by morning the old man had passed away peacefully in his sleep. As the moon hung in the sky, Adrian repeated his promise to the departed soul. The next day, Edgar presented Adrian with an ornate magic sword in a fine box, suggesting that while the master's final work was priceless, it might be inconvenient for a prince to use. He offered the magic sword as a more suitable alternative. Adrian inspected the new weapon, noting it was a decent middle-grade sword. He then complimented Edgar, stating that receiving the master's soul-forged blade was already a tremendous gift, but to then offer a magic sword on top of it showed the Ellen family's truly exceptional loyalty. Edgar's face froze in a pained smile. His scheme to use the magic sword as bait to reclaim the master's priceless work had backfired spectacularly, leaving him looking like a fool who just gave away a good sword for nothing. Later, Vale ordered the cavalry to ride ahead at full speed to make up for the delay. As Adrian prepared his horse, Vale approached, remarking that he had been busy. He mentioned he had been on a separate assignment from the king during their stay. Adrian mused that his little trip hadn't been free after all. Vale told him to get ready, as they needed to ride hard to reach Ironline Castle by nightfall. Adrian looked at him blankly and stated that he didn't know how to ride a horse. Vale was stunned into silence. How could he know? How could he bother? Adrian was a sword. He'd been ridden by heroes, not the other way around. The journey to Iron Lion Castle began with a rather undignified start. It turned out that a legendary sword, having spent centuries being swung around, had never actually developed sea legs, or in this case, horse legs. The trip was filled with a few twists and turns, mostly Adrian's stomach. He looked absolutely wretched from the motion sickness, but they eventually reached their destination, albeit a half-day behind schedule. As they approached the imposing fortress, Adrian took in the sight of Iron Lion Castle. Knights in gleaming armor filed out to meet them. A man named York of the Walladin family, flanked by his soldiers, formally greeted the prince. Adrian could feel the spirit in the air, thick with a hostility that was almost comical in its intensity. He knew the reason for their animosity. It was obvious. Deciding to stir things up, he called out to his newest knight. Arwen stepped forward, kneeling before him and declaring that she had counted the days until his arrival. As expected, the knights behind her bristled with immediate fury. The sudden surge of hostility wasn't lost on Adelia, whose eyes began to glow with a dangerous light. Adrian quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, murmuring her name to calm her down. The glow faded, and she looked at him with a questioning glance. He was glad he had established her absolute obedience early on. With that settled, he turned his attention back to the simmering knights. He called for Arwen to follow him, inviting her and her glowering colleagues along to catch up. Later, having changed into simpler attire and carrying a wooden training sword, Adrian faced a crowd of apprentices. He announced his wish to witness the swordsmanship of the famed Iron Lions and asked who would be the first to show him their skill. The apprentices hesitated, murmuring amongst themselves. Adrian could see their reluctance, so he offered a wager, staking the Lomberg name that no one would be held responsible for the outcome of the spar. He then taunted them, suggesting their title as the kingdom's best was merely a bluff. That did the trick. A red-headed knight named Dale stepped forward. Though he felt he was lacking, he accepted the challenge on behalf of the Iron Lions and dared to stand before the prince. Adrian simply smiled, reminding the boy that he had asked for a challenger first. Dale charged forward with a warning. Adrian met him with a calm expression, his wooden sword glowing with mana. The clash was brief and brutal. Dale was sent flying, knocked out in a single blow. Adrian stood over him, his mana heart glowing faintly, and simply said, "Next." The other knights stared in shock. One after another, they stepped up to challenge him. Paul Rothheim, a third-year apprentice, thought his seniority over Dale would make a difference. It did not. Hallie, Judith, and others followed, each boasting of their rank or the honor of their order, and each was swiftly and unceremoniously defeated. Adrian deflected their attacks effortlessly. The training ground soon littered with broken wooden swords and unconscious apprentices. He let out a sigh of disappointment, then called out the official knights, chiding them for their slowness. He singled out Arwen, informing her that when he returned to the capital, she would be coming with him. She gave a slight, knowing smile and affirmed her loyalty. Just then, a senior knight with long white hair stepped forward, finding the whole affair too easy. Hearing that the prince enjoyed wagers, he proposed a bet to liven things up. If he defeated Adrian, he wanted, but Adrian cut him off instantly. Denied, he said flatly. Arwen was not some tournament prize. Instead, Adrian proposed a different bet. He had Carl bring him the magic sword from Edgar. If the knight won, the sword was his. Both the knight and Arwen were taken aback by the offer. Arwen tried to protest, but Adrian stopped her, stating that a swordmaster like her was 1,000 times more precious than any mere sword. Her value was beyond compare. The knight, Dunham, accepted the terms with a smirk. He introduced himself as an official knight on the verge of achieving a triple chain. Adrian dryly pointed out that this meant he was still just a double chain, which clearly irked him. Dunham then presented his own sword, revealing it to be the 17th work of the legendary Master Smith. He declared that if Adrian won, that sword would be his. Adrian smiled, calling it a coincidence. He too had a sword from the Master Smith. It was the Master's 100th and final work, completed just days ago. The news stunned Dunham, but he accepted the duel. Dunham gathered his mana, stating that while he found Adrian's path misguided, he respected the effort it took. Adrian scoffed at the condescending remark. The opinions of outsiders were insignificant to him. His path was not his own to begin with. The only respect he needed was from his people, like Arwen and Adelia. The respect from them was more than enough. He then turned to Adelia. He told her to watch closely, for he was about to demonstrate the path she would walk from now on. Blue energy erupted around him, forming the spectral image of a dragon-slaying hero. Adelia and Arwen watched, mesmerized. As Adrian's power flared, Adelia clenched her fists, her heart filled with a new resolve. She would surely follow him down that path. As two men sat enjoying a cup of tea, one asked the other how many times the princes had visited Iron Lion Castle. The other, Vale Balahard, considered the question thoughtfully. He recounted the visits. The fourth prince had no interest. The third and fifth came while Adrian was on probation, and even the second had stopped by recently. The first man, York Willowden, slammed his cup down, declaring that no matter Adrian's past reputation, he was still the legitimate heir. He angrily accused Vale of bearing a large share of the blame for the prince's isolation, arguing that if Vale had offered even a little support, the prince wouldn't have become so alienated. He demanded to know why Vale was acting like a guardian now, after all this time. Vale calmly admitted that York was not wrong. He had indeed cast his nephew aside once, seeing him as a future tyrant. He recalled a time when he had reprimanded a drunken Adrian only for the belligerent boy to charge at him with a sword. Vale had seen him then as nothing more than a hopeless scoundrel. After returning north, Adrian had sent him a bottle of poisoned wine as a gift. Vale had opened it and drunk it down, using his mana to burn away the cheap poison and, with it, any lingering familial affection. However, that scoundrel had changed. He now endured grueling training and grew stronger by the day. York, still furious, reminded Vale that he himself had once insisted the first prince must never become king. Valen merely stared into his teacup, his reflection showing a boy who was now completely different from his past self. He explained that all he wanted was to give Adrian a chance to stand on the same starting line as the other princes. He then stood and bowed deeply, begging York for his understanding. York was baffled by the change in the stern commander, admitting he couldn't tell who had changed more, Vale or the prince. Vale simply looked down, lost in his thoughts. Their conversation was interrupted by a knight bursting in, exclaiming something about the first prince. Outside, Vale reassured York that Dunham knew his limits and wouldn't let things get too serious. York added that even in a live blade duel, a knight wouldn't beat royalty senseless. Vale cryptically replied that it wasn't the prince he should be worried about, but his own knight. York, now thoroughly confused by Vale's strange behavior and pale face, dismissed it as nonsense. Just then, a loud crash echoed from the training grounds. They turned to see Dunham lying defeated on the ground. The crowd erupted. Even Dunham had been knocked out. York stared in disbelief while Vale smirked, reminding him of his warning. Adrian, panting slightly, called for the next challenger. The world around him seemed to fade into blue energy. He recalled his uncle's words. A knight's true journey began at 2 rings. Now, facing a double-chain knight, he understood. The power was no exaggeration. His innocent felt insufficient, but using the dragon-slaying him on a regular knight was like using a nuke to open a pickle jar. Total overkill. Instead, he pushed his focus to its absolute limit. Activating, his body moved on its own. The world went quiet, and his body moved on its own, his eyes glowing with an intense blue flame. It was the same sensation he'd felt before, a state of perfect instinct. He met Dunham's attack in a brilliant flash of power, sending the knight crashing to the ground. Catching his breath, he called for the next opponent. One by one, the official knights stepped up, and one by one, they were defeated. He fought with a focused calm, his movements a blur of controlled energy. Each clash was decisive, his blade moving with an almost supernatural precision. He parried and countered, his eyes glowing with power. When the last knight fell, Adrian stood victorious amidst the defeated, panting but triumphant. He was still breathing heavily. The apprentices, who had once been hostile, now cheered for him. Through these battles he had endured 1,000 waves, 100 bouts. A new verse was added to his hymn, a promise to stand tall against even greater challenges. He would now rise, holding the sword with this new resolve. The grade of his hymn evolved, transforming from Fungungwa to the extraordinary grade. He had succeeded. The effort left him momentarily drained, and he stumbled. A knight rushed to his side, asking if he was all right. It was York's son, now showing him respect for his victory. The entire crowd of knights, once his bitter antagonists, now cheered for his fighting spirit and his triumph. Adrian was bewildered by the sudden change in attitude. York explained that they were simple men. Nothing excited them more than the sword and a hard-won victory. He correctly guessed that Adrian had expected their resentment, but for these knights a fair defeat was more valuable than a tainted victory. When both sides fought their hardest, the outcome was secondary to the struggle itself. The apprentices joked that Dunham might be a bit resentful, though since he now had to hand over the sword he had bragged so much about. Kneeling on the ground, Adrian reflected. He had fought the old ways. The spirit of the sword he embodied had been forgotten along with the mana heart, but it seemed one thing hadn't changed. The true spirit of the knights, being gracious in defeat and revering the strong, was still alive and well. The day of departure arrived, and Adrian's party prepared to leave Iron Lion Castle. With a smirk, he bid farewell to the assembled knights, promising they would meet again. Count Willodin wished him health, and Adrian returned the sentiment. Just as he was about to leave, he turned back to the Count and requested that the events of his stay be kept secret. Willodin, confused, asked if it wouldn't be more helpful to publicize his victory. Adrian simply smiled mysteriously, explaining that there was someone he wanted to mess with a little. Later, on the road back to the capital, Carl announced they would camp for the night. Adrian told Carl he was going to scout the area for a moment, and Carl nodded his assent. Arwen, who had been following Adrian, still seemed a bit out of place, but he figured she would adapt soon enough. Yawning, Adrian decided to head into his tent to rest. Inside, Adelia greeted him with a perfect maid-like posture. He sighed inwardly. He had an S-rank sword genius on his hands, and she was still tidying up his tent. She noticed his expression and timidly asked if something was wrong. He waved it off, telling her to leave so he could rest. Lying down, he reflected on the Iron Lion Knights. Using his judgment ability, he had seen that most of them had B-grade talent at best. In his era, people with such meager potential would have faded into obscurity after a lifetime of training. Yet here, they had reached the level of sword experts in their 20s and 30s. The caliber of superhumans had declined, but the overall level of ordinary people had risen dramatically. The reason was Mana Chain. His uncle had the potential for transcendence, which was why Adrian had been so disappointed that he'd thrown it away for the Mana Chain technique. But this new era didn't even offer the chance to achieve anything beyond an extraordinary grade. It was all due to the flow of time. He had to admit he didn't know this era well and resolved to start learning again from the beginning. Suddenly, Vale appeared in his tent, commending his mindset. He told Adrian it wasn't too late to achieve his dream, which left the prince utterly confused. Vale explained that Adrian had already won the hearts of the Iron Lions, something his brothers could never do. He called it a wise judgment, which only baffled Adrian further. Adrian asked if his uncle had gone mad, reminding him of their bet. Vale corrected him, stating the bet wasn't about defeating the third prince, but about defeating a double-chain knight, a condition Adrian had already met by beating Dunham. Vale declared he would now fulfill his promise, leaving Adrian to wonder what he was talking about. As a count and commander, Vale Ballarhard officially pledged his support to the first prince, Adrian Leonberg. Adrian stared, completely bewildered by the sudden declaration of political support. A horrifying thought dawned on him. He had never, not once, said he wanted to be king. Val's declaration became a political bombshell. Upon their return to the capital, Adrian was met with a flood of congratulations. Newly assigned royal knights and servants from the palace swarmed his residence, and he was suddenly at the center of a chaotic storm of attention. He finally snapped, ordering everyone to be sent back immediately. Carl informed him that they were there by royal decree and wouldn't listen. Adrian then demanded they at least get out of his sight, as their presence was annoying him to death. Once his rooms were cleared, he finally had a moment of peace. It was short-lived. His brother, the third Prince Gillian, burst into the room, demanding to know why he was there. Gillian accused him of playing the fool, secretly learning swordsmanship and revealing grand ambitions. He had intended to save Adrian's face by allowing him a graceful defeat, and now he felt betrayed. Adrian, bored, sarcastically thanked him for his profound generosity. Gillian, enraged, promised to make him pay dearly for the deception. Adrian was exasperated. He had no interest in the throne and now had to find the culprit who started this whole mess. He confronted his uncle, telling him to back out of this political game because he had no interest in the throne. Vale, unconcerned, asked if he was worried about the Ballarhard family's future. He explained that his family was the shield protecting the kingdom from the northern monsters, and as long as the nobles remembered the harshness of winter, they would be safe. Adrian felt a small sense of relief, but Vale pressed on, reminding him of the fate of firstborns who failed to succeed the throne. He offered Adrian time to accept the situation, but warned him that the legitimacy of the firstborn only disappears with death. Adrian sighed, knowing his uncle wouldn't listen. His true goal was to reclaim his transcendent power. The throne was a triviality in comparison. He had definitely believed that, right up until the moment a herald announced the entrance of the eldest son of the royal family at a grand banquet. Seeing all the eyes on him, the stern gaze of his uncle, the sly smile of a mysterious woman, he stood at the podium and felt an unfamiliar and not entirely unpleasant thrill.